This video is going to use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to help understand events that could happen to the macroeconomy. And in particular, in this case, I'm going to consider the decrease in aggregate demand. What we're going to do here and how we're using the ADAS model to help us understand the economy is that we're going to do what's called a comparative statics. And it's the same thing we did with the supply and demand diagram when we said, like, oh, well, what happens when there's an increase in the demand for peaches? And if you remember, we would trace that out, we shift the demand curve to the right, find the new equilibrium, and we see that there would be typically there's going to be an increase in the price of peaches and an increase in the equilibrium quantity of peaches. And so we could take an event like that and say, something happens, we have the economy in equilibrium, something happens, there's a shift in supply or demand, and we can trace through the effects of it. And that whole exercise, the start of the equilibrium, have an event happen, and trace out the new equilibrium is referred to as comparative statics. So we're really doing comparative statics in this model. There are a lot of different ways you could shift the different curves. The specific one I'm looking at here is a shift in aggregate demand, and specifically a decrease in aggregate demand. You could have an increase in aggregate demand that would be the exact, sort of like 180-degree polar opposite of this. You'd be shifting the aggregate demand curve in the other direction. So I'm just going to do this video in terms of comparative statics. They go through some other examples of them in the book. So there are three things to do this comparative statics exercise. There's three things you do. Point number one that I have written up here is you start with the economy in a long-run equilibrium, and that's what I've drawn here. We start, the economy is in long-run equilibrium. Output has to be Y star, it has to be at the full employment level, and we have that there. And then the price level has to be P1, or it turns out to be P1. And so I've got an aggregate demand curve drawn in here, and with that aggregate demand curve in here, it intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve at P1. And then I've got a short-run aggregate supply curve drawn in here, because that represents the short-run aggregate supply curve when you've got prices, the prices that have to be fixed, and then the wages and other input prices that get fixed. They are fixed, assuming that the price level in the economy is going to be P1, and that turns out to be what the price level is. And so we've got a nice long-run equilibrium in the economy. Okay, and this is just the starting point. And when you do any of the comparative statics diagrams, you basically start with this point on all of them. You start from this type of a framework, a long-run equilibrium. Point number two, the event happens, whatever it happens to be. And in this case, we're considering a decrease in aggregate demand. So I'm going to draw a second aggregate demand curve in here. It's to the left of the first aggregate demand curve. We'll show a shift here, and this is a decrease. And again, in chapter 13, they talk about some of the different factors that could lead to a decrease in the aggregate demand like this. So any of those factors happen, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. And after you draw that shift, you find the next thing you do is you find the short-run equilibrium. Short-run equilibrium, and I already had one video just to talk about just how you do find the short and long-run equilibrium. Short-run equilibrium is intersection of aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply curve. So the short-run aggregate supply curve here is SRAS1. I've got that drawn up there in pink. And the new aggregate demand curve here is AD2. They intersect here. So that's the short-run equilibrium. And that would involve a price of P2. And output that we'll draw here, I'll label this Y2, because Y2 and P2 are together here. And Y2 is less than Y star. There's the level of output less than the full employment level. And that's the short-run equilibrium. It's relatively simple. Again, it's the short-run equilibrium, aggregate demand equals intersects short-run aggregate supply. That occurs here. And we've got that. And then point 3 says, find the new long-run equilibrium. Well, in this case, and depending on the event, sometimes the new long-run equilibrium was the initial long-run equilibrium. But in this case, since we have a shift in the aggregate demand curve, and remember, AD and the long-run aggregate supply curve determine the long-run equilibrium. AD intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve here. So this has to be the new long-run equilibrium. And that's a price level. I'll label it here P3. That's our price level here. And then we've got our output. The output will be at Y star. In this ADAS framework, the long-run equilibrium output has to be Y star, right? The long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, unless you're talking about something that would shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. Then the long-run output remains Y star, whatever the full employment output is. And so this would be our new long-run equilibrium. And so you see there's a decrease in aggregate demand. We have a short-run equilibrium that's here. Oh, and the long-run equilibrium is here. Let me label that. So the short-run effect is a reduction in prices of the price level from P1 to P2. So some prices are falling, but remember, some are fixed. And so in effect, the average price level, remember, because the CPI is the average of all the different prices in the economy, some prices fall, others remain fixed. They're fixed at too high of a level, so we have a short-run equilibrium at P2 and Y2. And then those prices that are fixed, we realize now they're fixed at, assuming that the overall price level is P1, but the overall price level is going to be P3 instead. So those prices that were fixed have to adjust. And as they adjust, in effect, what we do is we end up having a new short-run aggregate supply curve. Because in the video, when we talk about the aggregate supply, you sort of think of each of these short-run aggregate supply curves as being based on the average price level, the price level at which AD intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve. So when AD intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve, it would give us a long-run price level of P3. We need to have, in effect, the short-run aggregate supply curve that's based with like prices and wages and other input prices that have to be fixed in advance. They have to be fixed at what would correspond to the P3 level. And what we can see is that with the decrease in aggregate demand, we have to have all the prices in the economy adjust down to this P3 level. And when we do that, and the prices in wages that are fixed get adjusted down to this new level, we have a new short-run aggregate supply curve, and we're back to a new long-run equilibrium, which has also got to be a short-run equilibrium. So that's why I've drawn in a new short-run aggregate supply curve. This particular comparative statics exercise, a decrease in aggregate demand, gives us a short-run equilibrium where output is less than the full employment level. And I did a video on this one to consider this one because this is one of the scenarios then in which we would get a recession in the economy. So what could cause a recession in the economy? Something that would cause a decrease in aggregate demand. It causes a decrease in aggregate demand, and then that's going to give us a recession, a short-run equilibrium where output is less than the full employment level. Eventually, prices will adjust, and prices will adjust to get us to a new long-run equilibrium at full employment. The question for whether it's worthwhile for the government to try to take some policy to offset this shift in aggregate demand would in part be a function of how long it takes the economy to make this adjustment from the short-run equilibrium and then get back to a new long-run equilibrium. If that occurs relatively quickly, or the faster that adjustment occurs, the less of a role there would be for policy. Because in effect, this short-run equilibrium involves pain. Output's less than Y star. That's going to also be corresponding to unemployment being above the full employment level. We'll have cyclical unemployment in the economy. So it's a reduced standard of living and unemployment, which is painful for the people who have to go through unemployment. But at some level in this framework, we know that period of pain is somewhat limited. So the policy question is, would there be something that through the government could, either through fiscal policy, spending and taxes, that's discussed in chapters 15 and 16, or monetary policy, and changing the money supply discussed in 17 and 18, is there something that the government could do to, in effect, offset or prevent, either prevent or offset or more quickly get us to the new long run equilibrium, or keep us at Y star, as opposed to having this period of pain. But again, whether it's worth doing something about that period of pain would in fact be, sort of like, how long is it going to last? And so, if you've if you've suffered an injury, and at some level it's going to heal on its own, whether you want to have whether you want to have surgery to address it would in fact part be, how quickly will you get better on your own, or is it the kind of thing that wouldn't get better on its own? So, would you rather have surgery to offset the effect of an injury you suffered, or let the injury heal on its own? And part of that answer, whether you're going to want to have surgery, would be how quickly are you going to heal on your own? So in other words, how quickly does the economy go from here back to here? If that happens relatively quickly, there'll be less of a role for policy. But this is one of the comparative statics efforts or exercises that gives us a short run equilibrium with output below Y star. And so this is a recession in the economy in the ADAS model.